What country are you based in? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, just want to know what countries you guys are based in.
Well, I am from Pakistan. I'm
Okay.
from Lahore.
Okay. All right, thanks. That's very, very good. And that will feed into what we are doing in today. So today we'll be looking at learning outcome 3, understanding the legal and ethical aspects of developing HR policy. First thing I will say about this topic is we are going to be talking about UK law and legislation quite a bit, employment law, UK employment law. But a couple of things to note. Each country will have different employment law. So Pakistan will have a different employment law. Dubai will have a different employment law. So, but we're studying UK for 2 reasons. First, we are doing a level 7 UK qualification. So obviously we need to study UK legislation for that qualification. But also, many countries use the UK law as a role model. They pattern after the UK law. So they will have the same principle, but the actual specification and rule will be different. But the idea behind the law, the principle behind the law, will usually be the same, especially countries that have had contact with the UK or have been colonized by the UK. So you will have, you will understand quite a bit by studying UK law, which is what we are going to focus on today. And ethics. Ethics obviously is a higher standard than law, and we mentioned that today.
All right.
Right, great. So please, if there's any questions, just feel free to stop me as usual, ask the questions. Also, the other thing is I've scheduled a special session on the assignment. I believe that will be after the last session. We'll go straight into an extra 30 minutes or so where we'll be looking at the assignment questions. So you should have gotten invite here. Okay, so let's look at the idea behind HR policies. Basically, HR policies provide a framework for both the employee and the employer, that's the organization or the company, in which people can be treated fairly and equitably, and the managers can make consistent decisions. So it allows managers to make consistent decisions and allows employees to be treated fairly and equitably, right? It also allows clear communication of on what the organization stands for on certain issues to everyone, especially to employees. And then it talks about we now need to start looking at the condition of employment and the contract of employment being a key aspect of the of HR policy. So we'll look at that very quickly. But first of all, let's just highlight what this research showed. So the Organization and Strategic Information Service did some research some time ago where they looked at the significance of HR policies, and they mentioned 4 key areas where HR policies are useful, most importantly. One is in terms of clarifying organizational structure, second one in terms of legal issues, which we'll look at quite a bit today, the employee handbook in terms of some wider policies and procedures, and then the issue of consistency, which is very important for HR. So let's look first of all at the organizational structure. Your HR policies and procedures provide clear guidance on roles in the organizational structure, who does what, and accepted norms of behavior, work schedules, health and safety measures, things like that. So policies create, this is very important, so I'll just highlight that. They create rights and responsibilities, right, for both parties. So on the company side, the company will have rights, things that the company can expect from the employee. It will also create responsibilities on the company side, things that we expect the company to give or to do. On the employee side, it does the same thing. It creates rights for the employees, rights and duties. That is, rights. These are things the employee expects to receive, right? It also creates duties and responsibilities, things we expect the employee to do or to give. So for both sides, company and employee, rights and duties are created for both. And that's the essence of HR policies. And obviously, these HR policies can be enforced in a court of law, or you can get damages in terms of money where they've been breached. So, for instance, if they've been breached, you can sue your employer to court and so on and win some amount of money. So they are very, obviously very important. They also are a focus for government regulation and government monitoring. When government wants to come down hard on the company who they think are breaching legislation, often because that legislation will be giving effect through company policies. Where the company either doesn't have the right policies or doesn't implement them, even if it has them, then it can enter trouble with the regulators of the government. So it's quite an important issue.
Okay.
Yeah. So the next thing we'll talk about in terms of HR policies are the legal issues. So we know that, like I've mentioned, HR policies can be enforced in the court of law. Usually we call that an employment tribunal or industrial tribunal. And they can give, they create legal obligations, right? So these rights and responsibilities are legal issues, and that's why we're dealing with them. And they start off in a contract of employment. So I'll just highlight this slide a little bit. This is one of my extra slides just to highlight what we mean by contract of employment. So when you go through a recruitment process, you advertise a job, you interview the candidate, you select the best one, you offer them the job. The recruitment process flows into offering a contract of employment. And that contract is a legal contract. That means you are legally bound by the rights and responsibilities created in that contract of employment. Now, one thing to note about employment contract is it can be oral, right? So where you offer someone a job by word of mouth and the person accepts. So you have an offer, you have acceptance, you have consideration, that's the expectation of money, or money will be passed on in terms of salary. That fulfills all the requirements for legal contract. So you can sue based on an oral contract, and this is important especially for small businesses who tend to do things informally and would offer sometimes an oral contract and think they are not bound by it. They are bound by it. Obviously, as a good HR practitioner, we encourage all contracts of employment to be written down. In fact, the UK now has some legislation that says within 2 months of your starting work, you have the right to get a written document which clarifies your contract of employment. But the best practice, HR best practice, is to right from day one issue a contract of employment that is written. But we have to note and train you guys to the fact that your words, your verbal contract is legally binding. So you have to be careful as a manager making an offer of employment, right, and things like that. That's part of the legal contract. So that's the one important thing to know about the contract of employment. The contract of employment would specify some rights of employees. Some examples of rights would include, obviously, maternity rights. You have the right to maternity leave if you get pregnant or you're a nursing mother. In some countries, and this is where I say the UK is quite different from some other countries, you also have similar rights for fathers. So we have paternity rights, parental leave, paternity leave, adoption rights. The UK even provides similar adoption leave where you don't have a biological child but you've adopted a child, you can also take leave. You are provided with entitlement to leave. So the right to request flexible working is a right in the UK. In some other countries in Europe, the right to actually have flexible working. In the UK, it's merely a right to request. You can request the business will now consider whether there's a good business case and may decide to grant or not. For some countries, you don't even have a right to request flexible working. You don't have a right to adoption. But something like maternity rights is fairly widely universal, quite a universal right. But it will be different from country to country. Some countries maybe it's 3 months maternity leave, other countries maybe 9 months or 6 months. Some with pay, some with different levels of pay. But the point is, you get the idea. It's maternity leave. Each country you now have to check the specific legislation. So that's why we use the UK legislation to give a good idea, because a lot of countries will role model after it. It does give a good idea. Important rights also, you may have the right to trade union representation in some countries, right to grievance and disciplinary procedures. So a disciplinary procedure is where the company makes a complaint against an employee. There's a process to follow. A grievance where the employee makes a complaint against either the company or fellow employees. For instance, maybe they've been sexually harassed or they've been bullied or so on, and there's a very similar process to follow. You have rights regarding minimum pay, for instance, minimum wage, maximum working week, how many hours an employee can work before they have to take a rest break. Rights regarding annual leave. So, for instance, in some countries like America, you have shorter annual leave, whereas in Europe you have right to more annual holidays. Right to strike, what we call industrial action, right to strike if you're a member of the trade union. So the point also we need to make here is, in some of these cases, the law is silent. The law of a specific country, let's say Pakistan, may not specify a right to flexible working. So in that case, it's now up to the company to have it as a policy or not. It's totally voluntary. But where the company puts it as a policy, then the company has to abide by that. If not, the employee council. They have now created a legal obligation. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is a scenario where the legislation of the country has not mandated this thing, but the company voluntarily decides to have it as a policy. Then they are bound by it. An alternative scenario is where the country actually mandates it. So like maternity leave, many countries will say every company must grant XYZ amount of months or whatever to women who are, pregnant, and this is the criteria where they qualify for it, how they can claim it, and so on and so forth. And in that case, the company has no option but to obey the law. The company must obey the law and provide that, but it will usually specify this in a policy, so the employees know the process to claim and if there's any conditions for entitlement and so on, right? Of course, all that has to abide by the law. The thing also with a situation where a country has mandated it is that the company can also decide to go above the mandate. It cannot go below the mandate, but it can go above the mandate. So, for instance, where the minimum wage is fixed at £8 per hour, the company can voluntarily decide to say our minimum wage in this company will be £10 per hour. It can do £8, it can do £9, it can do £10, it can do. If it does £10, it has to be bound by it. It has created that obligation. It's enforceable in court. But it cannot go below £8. It cannot go down to £5, where the country has put a mandate. So these are the issues with HR policies. Where there's no mandate, company is free to do anything, but where it does something, it's bound by it. Where there is a mandate, the company must abide by the mandate. The company cannot go below the mandate, but the company can voluntarily go above the mandate. Or where it goes above the mandate, again, it has to be bound by it. So these are the issues with employment contract, right? And we also have what we call implied terms and express terms. So express terms are, in your contract of employment, things will be specified. We expect you to work for 40 hours a week and you paid $1,000 per month. Those are express terms. We expect you to have 20 days annually. Right? Those are express terms and are very clear. But you are also bound by what we call implied terms. These are terms that are assumed into your contract. Because we cannot write everything. If we try to write every single thing in a contract of employment, it will be 1,000 pages long and we'll still miss some things. So there are some reasonable assumptions the court makes in saying that there are implied terms that create rights and responsibilities for both the employee and the organization. So, for instance, implied terms, there's an implied term that every employee should use reasonable care and skill. When they're doing their work, they should be diligent and should use reasonable care and skill. They shouldn't do it just, anyhow to poor quality. There's a reasonable assumption that every employee should obey lawful orders from their superiors. There's a reasonable assumption and implied term that employees should take care of the employer's property and not abuse or destroy or sabotage the employer's property. There's a reasonable assumption that employees should act in good faith. You cannot be employed by Coca-Cola but acting on behalf of Pepsi-Cola, who is their competitor, their rival. Right? There's an implied term there that even though it's not written expressly into the contract, it's not in black and white, it's implied into that contract of employment, right? And so on and so forth. In countries like UK, you don't necessarily need to go straight to employment tribunal, which is the court. You can go to what we call ATHE, there's a mediation and conciliation service, which tries to do a more friendly mediation. And because when you have a dispute between employer and employee, if you go to court, it damages the relationship, right? So it may be better to have a more friendly, less formal mediation, and companies are advised to follow the ACA's guidelines on grievance, court process, disciplinary process, and so on and so forth to show that they are doing HRM to a good standard. So these are things, that we emphasize when we talk about the legal and ethical aspects of HRM policy. We talked about the contract of employment quite a bit, and we talked about, earlier on the organizational structure. So in terms of legal issues, the major thing there I would like to highlight is the contract of employment, and through that we also talked about where the country mandates a law, doesn't mandate a law, what to do in these situations. So some examples of UK employment legislation that are quite important. One is the National Minimum Wage Act, which specifies that there will be a national minimum wage, which is now called a living wage. Although it's not really a living wage. But the actual figure changes year by year. The law is there, past years, whenever, 1998 or whatever. But the actual figure keeps changing every year. So the law empowers the government to announce the figure every year, which they do every April. So there are some laws like that the way they are passed allows the government to update them regularly. So the national minimum wage law, one of that. So as a HRM department, you have to be up to date with those kind of changes to employment. So that is obviously a mandate. The company must abide by that. The company cannot pay below. The company can choose to pay above. So if it chooses to pay what is called a real living wage, that is an amount that you think you can live on, where in some cities, like London is quite an expensive city compared to smaller cities, right? So we say that if you are paid the same minimum wage in London, you may not actually be able to live on it, pay your rent, food, and so on. So some advocates talk about a living wage. Some companies now, out of ethics, have gone for the higher principle. So this is the distinction I was trying to make between law and ethics. The law says you must pay a minimum wage. Some companies have now come and say, well, we know that some employees in big cities, the cost of living in those cities is too expensive. So if we pay them this minimum wage, they can't really survive on it. They can't live on it. They can't pay their rent and buy food and live a basic decent life. So they have a different calculation which they do, and say, well, actually the living wage is £10 per hour, whereas the minimum wage is £8 per hour for a city like London. So voluntarily, as an ethical company, we have chosen to pay the living wage, which is £10 per hour, and they put it as a company policy. And once they do that, they become bound by law. If they breach that policy, the employees can take that to court, right? So this is the role of ethics which is very closely related to law but different and usually at a higher standard. Another key piece of legislation we need to highlight is the working time regulation, and this one again shows the influence of international law. So this actually came from EU directives, EU legislation into the UK because it affects all EU countries, and it basically says if you work for 40 hours or whatever, you must take a rest break and so on and so forth. If not, some people will work for 100 hours straight and they will drop dead in the workplace, or we have to take them straight to hospital from work because they are overworked. So to protect the health of employees, one, from companies who may be abusive and exploitative and want workers to work long hours, but two, also to protect employees from themselves where they may not have the self-discipline to stop, or they may be under financial pressure or whatever and not take care of their health. We say no. You need to work this maximum amount of time and then you must take a rest break. And it's different for some professions, like if you're a driver, where we know that you can fall asleep on the steering wheel and endanger your life and the life of your passengers and other users. There's even a different condition concerning their hours and rest breaks also. That's an important piece of legislation. So you need to now look for the equivalent in Pakistan, Dubai, Karachi, wherever, Saudi Arabia, Bolivia, wherever you are. There will be similar legislation which will specify different hours, but the idea is the same. That's why we teach UK law, to give you the basic idea, but the UK law may say 8 hours break, whereas maybe Pakistani law may say 5 hours break. But at least you have the idea. The Employment Rights Act of 1996 creates the rights and responsibilities around what we call unfair dismissal and things like that, wrongful dismissal and so on. So what do we classify as a fair or unfair dismissal? What do we classify as a wrongful dismissal? And so what are the rights of employees to stay in work and not be arbitrarily dismissed? The Pension Act, obviously pension is an important part of your employment contract where you have access to a pension fund. So that specifies the duties of both the employer and employee concerning the pension, which is quite important. Health and safety regulation is very, very important for HR. Where a company is negligent concerning health and safety, can lose a lot of money because the courts will award. This is one area where the courts are happy to award high level of damages, going to the millions of dollars or pounds, because what is at risk is life or limb. That is the permanent or temporary disability or even death of an employee or someone else lawfully on the premises of the organization, like a distributor or supplier or customer of the organization. So the health and safety regulations are very important, and HR usually has a lot to play in that regard. Employees also have rights and responsibilities regarding this, not just the company. So, for instance, the company's duties will be, for instance, to make sure that stairways have lights and rails. If not, people can trip over the stairs and die or get wounded. To ensure there are no spillages on the floor that people can sleep on. To ensure that machinery is protected. There's helmets and hand gloves and glasses and earmuffs and all of that. All the what we PPE, personal protective equipment for the employees to use. Right? If not, for instance, in construction industries, a lot of people go deaf because if you work there for 5-10 years without noise, you can go deaf. But there are also responsibilities on the employee to use this equipment and to obey signs and warnings and regulations concerning how to behave with equipment, how to use the equipment, how to use machines. Right? So where the company has provided the equipment and clearly said you cannot enter this facility without wearing your helmet, and it's provided with a helmet, but the employee refuses or takes it off, then you now have the responsibility on the employee. So very key area is health and safety. Of growing importance nowadays in a global world, digital world, is data protection. It has become more and more important, especially the last 2 years when the EU across the EU passed the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, last year, 2018, I think it came into effect, which puts higher standards regarding the protection of personal data, because organizations hold a lot of personal data. They hold personal data of employees, your personal records, your house address, your bank account details, your spouse or children's details, next of kin, all of that stuff, right? Your ethnicity, age, gender, and so on. But also of customers. They hold all this data of customers, and that data we know in a digital world and a global world can be quite dangerous in the wrong hands. People can steal, impersonate, defraud, and so on with that kind of data. So, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question regarding this Data Protection Act. As we can see that in the current times, with the more and more globalization and presence of social media, I particularly work in the fashion retail business.
Okay.
So in this particular field, there's a lot of sharing of data. For instance, the company I work for is the owner of that company is friends with his competitors. So they're always sharing data with each other. And what we can imply over here, is it poor legislation, is it unethical, or is it there is some law or a global law for that, or it is only dependent upon the different laws of the country that the people are following or the companies are following?
So there's a very, very good question, and there are three aspects to the answer. The first aspect is you follow local law. Your first starting point is always what is the local law, right? But we know that where data is concerned in a global world, that data flows between countries. And you're a multinational company, moving between Karachi, London, and South Africa. So then the second point is, if there's an international regulation that covers that, fine. If not, you have to follow the three local legislations in all the countries. Right? So you follow the local legislation in more than one country, or an international framework that exists. Like the GDPR is an international framework that covers companies operating in the EU, including their operations outside the EU. As long as the company is operating in the EU, it's covered by the GDPR, including its branches outside the EU.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And then the third thing is ethics, and this is where Facebook, has come into problem recently, because they say, look, we are complying with American law, we are complying with Chinese law, but we are still. But people are saying what you are doing is still unethical. You comply with the law, but we know the law is a lower standard, ethics is the higher standard, and this is where your brand and reputation can be damaged. And therefore, we advise you to do what you consider to be the higher ethical standard where possible, right? Right now, there's a campaign on videos that are harmful to teenagers that promote suicide and things like that, right? They are saying Instagram has to remove them, and they've taken the campaign to Silicon Valley and so on and so forth, right? Because those videos are legal. Some of them are even, health advice videos and so on and so forth. But they're saying, no, you have to limit access to teenagers and children. You have to put some sort of screening device. Twitter, in the past week, had a problem. A couple of their staff were bribed by, I think, the Saudi Arabia government or something to access personal data on some individuals that the government, Saudi government.
Yes, I know about this one. Yeah. So the Saudi government did that. They had this guy who was looking after data of many individuals, and they had them interviewed in
So,
I don't know, remember the name of the hotel.
So that's a typical example where both the employees will face legal consequences, and the company itself will face legal consequences, because the company has not sufficiently protected the personal data.
Yes.
So telling employees that, oh, we expect you to be professional with this data, and then we'll give you access, we'll pay your salary, it's not enough. You now need to put checks in place to ensure that when you have a bad employee, they don't expose, this data. So that is a situation. What we are saying is companies are not doing enough, especially the social media companies. That's the trend now. They are really going down hard on them. And then where some of them also is difficult because some of them are political adverts that they used to make money. They are paid just like any other thing, but they are saying these political adverts are swaying elections. So that one is not data protection, not personal data protection, but it's abuse of, your social media platform. So, but it's a related point. So those are now ethical issues. So even where you are complying with the law, if you breach the ethics, because the thing is this, the law can change overnight, and where a government is annoyed with you, even if you have complied with the law, they will find a way to deal with you. They will find a way, even if you want taxation or something, they will harass your life. So you start seeing the trend of public opinion or government pressure going in that direction. Be careful. But also it raises the issue. A country like China that says we want you to give us access so we can monitor our citizens. We want you to block citizens from accessing the internet freely. That's actually the law. And then from a Western perspective, we say that law is unethical. So you now have a choice. You either operate in China or you don't operate in China. But if you operate in China, you have to comply with local legislation. But if ethically you say you will not, then you either have to pull out or try to find some middle ground or influence the Chinese government to soften. So those are the issues. So thanks very much. Very good question. So then we now talk about the employee handbook. So when we talked about the contract of employment, I mentioned that in reality, we don't like this contract of employment to run into 100 pages or 1,000 pages. It has to be a concise document, right? So not everything can be in employment contract. Therefore, the court claims there are something called implied terms, things we can imply even if they are not written. In addition, you will now put some policies in the handbook rather than in the contract of employment, right? Or even if they are not in the handbook, they will be somewhere in the organization, such as your website or intranet, right? All the policies that are there create rights and responsibilities for both the employer and the employee. So they are deemed to be affect you once you sign that contract of employment. So when you sign the contract of employment, everything in the handbook now applies to you. Everything on the intranet where they list all their policies now applies to you. So the handbook therefore becomes quite important, right? So you now need to look at the content of the handbook and so on and so forth. It's a good reference material. It provides information about basic things around flow of information, reporting lines, and so on. But it also provides clear information, especially around some issues like your grievance process and your disciplinary process. Those two normally we don't put in contract of employment, but we tend to put them more in the handbook. Or if they're in a contract of employment that are very short, in the handbook we have a more detailed version where we talk about the disciplinary process and the grievance process. Now, very simply, the standard idea in most countries is where somebody is accused of something, you notify the person of the accusation in writing, give them time to prepare a defense and have a fair hearing. They have to be able to say their side. You can't just take a judgment in their absence, make up your mind without giving them an opportunity to defend themselves. You have to hold an investigation meeting. You can't jump to a conclusion without investigation. You must do an investigation where the person is called to the disciplinary meeting or grievance meeting. You have the right to be, in most countries, they have the right to be accompanied either by a member of a trade union or a fellow colleague who is their friend and is there for emotional support. Now, the person who accompanies them should not or is not expected to answer questions on their behalf. They can consult the person, so they can whisper together, but if the panel asks the employee a question, it's the employee who should answer. Of course, you can first consult the trade union and discuss the answer, but the trade unionist or whoever should not answer until the employee should be the one to answer. So those are just things to note. So you must have an investigation. You must hold a meeting where you provide the right to fair hearing, adequate notice in writing for the person to apply to attend the meeting, come with it, inform them they have the right to come with a colleague or trade union rep, and and then you take a decision based on the investigation and the person's defense and witnesses you call and so on, which is part of the investigation. In the UK, you have a right of appeal. So where either one party, the company or the employee, doesn't like the decision of that panel, they can appeal. Usually, if you go to a more senior manager who will be on the panel for the appeal, or a manager at the same level but a different person. So a different manager will hear the appeal. So that's the UK process specified by ATHE, which is if you don't do it, then you're in trouble as a company. So, of course, where the company or the employee usually doesn't like even the appeal decision, they can still go to court, which in the UK is called an employment tribunal in some countries and industrial tribunal. Some countries like America, you go straight to normal court. Or you can go to arbitration if you want to in some cases. So I did mention this in class. One thing to note about these disciplinary and grievance processes, which you find in practice when you actually practice this, is a lot of companies may have a genuine reason to fire somebody after a disciplinary case. Yes, the person actually defrauded the company, the person stole money, and there's evidence. But they didn't follow this process. They didn't give a written notice. They didn't allow the person come with a trade union rep if they choose to, and inform them they have the right to. They didn't ask for the person's side of the story. They just got CCTV evidence. CCTV showed them taking money from the till. The next day, your boss just comes and says they're fired. So yes, the person actually maybe stole that money from the company, but when you go to employment tribunal, if the person actually takes you to employment tribunal, the employment tribunal say, well, you didn't follow the due process. So the employee can win some money against you, damages. Usually an employment tribunal is very hesitant to force an employer to take back an employee. So even where you are unfairly, unlawfully dismissed, the employment tribunal is more interested in giving you the employee money as compensation rather than forcing you back to your employer, because the relationship is already strained. So why would you want to go back? So this is the thing. Even where you have CCTV evidence or whatever, still follow the due process. If not, that employee can win money against you as damages if they take you to employment tribunal. Right? And then this also raises the issue of suspension. Where is like in the UK, the rule is where is a case of a minor case what we call misconduct, and you don't suspend, you just go straight into the disciplinary area. But where is a gross misconduct, serious case, then you can suspend without pay, pending an investigation and a disciplinary hearing. Right? So that's some key things to note in this case. Now, one other key aspect of HR policy is the issue of consistency. This is very, very important. If you have employees and this one comes and says, oh, my father is ill, blah, 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 you say, oh, take 5 days off. The next day, another person comes and says, oh, take 2 days off. I can't give you 5 days because we are really busy now. Next day, another person comes and says, oh, my father is ill. You say, oh, no, sorry, we don't give leave for that. You've treated them inconsistently, and if they take you to court, you're going to lose. So you need policies that will have consistency. Number one. Number two, you can have the policies, but line managers don't implement them with consistency. Line managers try to be flexible or friendly with the employer or whatever, or harsh with the employer. So where you have the policy, that's not sufficient. The employment tribunal wants to know that not just do you have the policy that is consistent, you have been implementing it consistently. And that is the job of HR, to ensure line managers stick to the policy and implement it consistently. If not, when you go to employment tribunal to court, you're going to lose that case, and you can lose quite a lot of money as damages, as compensation for the employee. So the whole idea of HR is to treat people fairly and equitably and consistently. Fairness, an aspect of fairness is consistent treatment. We call this natural justice, that like cases should be treated alike. The principle of natural justice. So, now we'll look very quickly at some of the purposes of the HR policies. So one is rules. HR policies clarify rules what everyone's role is in the organization, who reports to who, whose job is to do what, who is supposed to take what decision, who is supposed to be the one to apply, who's the one supposed to apply, the one to approve, and so on. Right? Everyone knows whose job is what, whose role is what. Right? So clear reporting structures, clear organizational structure we mentioned at the beginning. Another purpose of HR policy is rules. They clearly state rules of behavior, norms of behavior, expected behavior, what is allowed, what is not allowed, what is permissible, what is not permissible, both on the part of the employee and on the part of the company, but also customers and clients. So we are also nowadays, because before marketing used to tell us, or they still tell us, the customer is always right. But now we now have a situation where the customer comes, they are abusive to your employee who is trying to attend to them. They are racist, they are sexist, they are homophobic, they are whatever, So we now have a situation where we are saying, no, we have to protect the employees also from abusive, racist, and so on customers, right? So these rules are rules we expect the company to abide by, the employees to abide by, but also the customers, suppliers, distributors to abide by, right? Especially when you're on company premises or dealing with company business. So we have to think of rules as just wider than employees, especially to protect the employees sometimes. We know that the bad behavior of an employee is the company that is often liable for it. You can't just say, oh, the employee was the one doing it. It's the company's reputation that suffers. If they go to court, the customer takes court, often it's the company that has to pay out, not that individual employee. Right? You can sack the individual employee, you can discipline them, but you still have to pay as a company for that employee's bad behavior. So you have to specify very clearly the rules. And then there are consequences for these behaviors. So normally your policies will specify consequences. For instance, gross misconduct, suspicion of gross misconduct, you can be suspended without pay or with pay, depending. If we now go through the investigation and disciplinary process and find that you are liable, you've done wrong, then you can have a consequence, which can be what we call a performance improvement plan, which is a performance issue, or a first warning, or a second warning, or a suspension, maybe 2 week suspension without pay, or 2 week suspension or half pay, or 1 month suspension, 2 months pay, or even a sack, a dismissal. First warning, second warning, dismissal, and so on. So there will be consequences specified in the policy. And that also protects the organization. So when the organization, for instance, wants to dismiss, the employee cannot say, why are you dismissing that? This should be a first one. You say, no. Based on the company policy, this category of offense, if you are found guilty, go straight to dismissal. No need for first one, the gross misconduct. I only do that way you specify the consequences clearly. Right? And remember, in the UK, the 2 main reasons for that legally you are allowed as a company to dismiss your employees are what we call conduct or capability. So conduct is where the employee has exhibited bad behavior, defrauded the company, sexually harassed somebody, whatever, punched their manager in the face or a colleague, or being rude or abusive to a customer. That's bad behavior, conduct. Then there's capability. This is what we call performance or performance management, where the employee has been underperforming. They have very bad performance, very bad quality of work. And in this case, what the UK law and ATHE guidelines says is you must first of all provide support and training to help the employee improve, performance improvement plan and so on with timelines. Where the employee has still not improved despite this peak performance improvement plan with the timeline, despite all the training and coaching and support, then we can go straight into a capability dismissal process. Eventually we can dismiss the employee. So those are some things to bear in mind. So HR policies also provide tools. You should also look at them as positive things, not just disciplinary and grievances and so on. There are tools that support employees and enable them and empower them. For instance, your flexible working policy allows employees, have this flexibility to work through Skype or work from home and so on. They can apply for this. They can see what their options are. Their policies around training, your training policies, learning and development. Oh, when the employee reads it, they say, oh, actually, if I work for 5 years for this company, I'm entitled to take a sabbatical or 1 year off to go and do an MBA, go and study, and then my job will still be waiting for me when I come back. So it provides tools and empowerment for the employees, support for the employees, and for the managers in dealing with issues. So you need to have an employee handbook, because this is also very useful in terms of supporting managers and employees, having the tools to know the information they need, decisions they need to take, and so on. Right? And then if there's a change in legislation, you need to be able to update your HR policies or handbook. So you have relevant policies, and especially where legislation has changed, very important. So in terms of impact, where the company hasn't done this right, HR has not done this right, then this is where you now have some of the ethical issues we've mentioned across the lecture. One, you have a legal consideration. If you breach the law of a country, then there are sanctions, which may be a fine, and in some cases even imprisonment of company directors or managers or employees. Or in some drastic cases, the company may be shut down, or the company may be kicked out of the country if it's a multinational. It may be barred from doing business in that country. Kicked out. Right? We saw this during the apartheid era in South Africa. Some countries, especially like countries in Africa, said any country that does business with South Africa that supports an apartheid racist regime, we will ban you from doing business in our country, we'll kick you out. That happens. The company reputation can suffer, your brand can suffer, your brand image. And this is very important for business, customers, and so on, stakeholders, and even for getting permission to do business from government in future, or from fellow organizations who may not want to do business with you, customers, everybody. So your company reputation is at stake. Employee loyalty is also at stake. High levels of employee loyalty, employee commitment, and employee engagement are at stake, because where you have good policies and you implement them well and fairly, then you are likely to have loyal and highly committed and productive employees. Where you either have bad policies, or you don't have policies, or you don't implement them well and inconsistent, then you have problem with dropping employee loyalty and commitment and engagement, right? And then you can be seen as an ethical company, who does the right thing and promotes ethics through your policies. So these are some ethical implications you need to think about as an organization. So that's the end of our lecture. There are some backup slides on different specific aspects of employment policy, especially to do with discrimination, things like equal opportunity, affirmative action, and so on and so forth, concerning age discrimination, racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and so on. You can obviously read this up on your own. Quite interesting stuff you can read on all this diversity and equality stuff. They are very important aspects of employee policy, equality and diversity. So that therefore what I read in backup slides. So any questions from today's lesson?
No, I guess this is fair enough.
Okay.
It's self-explanatory and well understood.
Okay. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure as usual.
You're welcome.
See you next week, and we'll also have some consult support next time. Okay.
Sure.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.